The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler. November 11th, St. Theodore the Studite. St. Plato, abbot of the monastery of Symbolion on Mount Olympus in Bithynia, had a brother-in-law whose 3 sons went to settle in his possessions of Sakkudion near Mount Olympus to lead an eremitical life there. The most fervent of the 3 brothers was the eldest of them, Theodore, who was about to turn 22. The young men persuaded St. Plato to resign from the government of his abbey and take charge of governing the Hermits of Sakkudion. Later, St. Theodore was sent to Constantinople to receive priestly ordination. The young man made such progress in virtue and learning that his uncle Plato entrusted him with the leadership of the community with unanimous consent. The young Emperor Constantine IV divorced his wife and married Theodota, who was a relative of St. Plato and St. Theodore. Both protested against this abuse. Constantine, who wished to win over Theodore, made him great promises and treated his relatives especially well. As he obtained no result, Constantine then went to the baths of Brusa near Sakkudion, in the hope that St. Theodore would come to pay him a visit of compliance, but neither the abbot nor any of his monks came to receive him. The emperor returned furious to his palace and immediately sent a platoon of soldiers with orders to banish Theodore and his most faithful followers. They were all banished to Thessalonica, where an edict was issued forbidding the inhabitants to give them asylum and help them, so that not even the monks of the region dared to reach out to them. St. Plato, who was already very old, was locked up in a cell in Constantinople. St. Theodore wrote to him from Thessalonica an account of the journey, in which he told him of the vicissitudes through which he and his companions had passed, and expressed his admiration for his former teacher. The exile lasted only a few months. The way it ended is a characteristic example of the brutal ambition that reigned there at that time. Indeed, in 797, Irene, the emperor's mother, dethroned her son and had his eyes gouged out. Irene, who reigned 6 years, summoned Theodore and his companions from exile. The saint returned to Sakkudion and reorganized the monastery. But in 799, as the monastery was an easy prey for the Arabs, the monks took refuge inside the city walls. St. Theodore was then entrusted with the direction of the famous monastery of Studios, which the consul Studius had built in 463 on a journey he made from Rome to Constantinople. Constantine Copronymus had expelled the monks, so that when St. Theodore arrived there were barely a dozen. Under his rule, the monastery grew to 1,000 inhabitants, including monks and servants. In the matter of monastic legislation, St. Theodore was the one who most contributed to the development of the tradition coming from St. Basil. St. Athanasius the Laureate applied the legislation of St. Theodore on Mount Athos, and from there it spread to Russia, Bulgaria, and Servia, where it is still the basis of monastic life. St. Theodore encouraged studies and the fine arts. The school of calligraphy he founded was famous for a long time. The saint's writings constitute a series of sermons, instructions, liturgical hymns, and treatises on monastic asceticism, in which he shows himself to be very moderate if compared to other Easterners. The saint once said to a hermit, "Do not practice austerity to satisfy your self-love. Eat bread, drink sometimes, wear shoes in winter, and eat meat when you need it." Theodore ruled the monastery peacefully for 8 years, amid the swirl of imperial politics, until the question of Constantine's adultery arose again. Emperor Nicephorus I chose the future Saint Nicephorus, who was then a layman, to occupy the patriarchal see of Constantinople. As Saint Nicephorus had not received orders, Saint Theodore, Saint Plato, and other monks opposed the appointment. The emperor held them prisoner for 24 days, after which, at the behest of Nicephorus and a small group of bishops, he restored jurisdiction to the priest Joseph, who had been demoted for having blessed the marriage of Constantine IV with Theodotus. St. Theodore and others refused to maintain communion with Joseph and to accept the decision that the marriage had been valid. Thus, St. Theodore, St. Plato, and Joseph, who was St. Theodore's brother and Archbishop of Thessalonica, were imprisoned on the Isle of the Princess. Theodore explained the matter by letter to the Pope, and St. Leo III replied praising his prudence and constancy. Theodore's enemies had spread a rumor in Rome that he had fallen into heresy and was displeased that he had not been appointed patriarch, so St. Leo III preferred to refrain from a definitive judgment. The Studite monks were dispersed in different monasteries and very badly treated. The exile of St. Theodore and his companions lasted 2 years, until the death of Emperor Nicephorus in 811. Theodore and the Patriarch Nicephorus were reconciled, since their attitude on the painful problem of the veneration of images was identical. In our article on St. Nicephorus, March 13th, we have already given certain details about the second iconoclastic persecution, which took place during the reign of Leo V, the Armenian. St. Theodore openly denied that the emperor had the right to interfere in ecclesiastical affairs, and on Palm Sunday, when St. Nicephorus had already been expelled, he ordered his monks to go out in solemn procession with the sacred images, singing a hymn that begins, "We reverence your sacred image, blessed saint." From that moment on, St. Theodore became the head of the Orthodox movement. Because he continued to defend the cult of images, the emperor banished him to Mysia, from where he continued to exhort the faithful by letters, some of which have been preserved. When his correspondence was discovered, the emperor banished him to Bonita, in Anatolia, and ordered the jailer, Nicetas, to scourge his victim. He was moved by the joy with which St. Theodore stripped himself of his tunic and offered his fasting-consumed body to the whip, and full of compassion, he had all those present leave the dungeon, placed a sheepskin on the saint's bed, and unloaded the blows on it, so that those outside could hear them. Finally, Nicetas scratched his arms to stain the whip with his blood, and went out to show it to the others. St. Theodore was able to write more letters to the faithful, to the patriarchs, and one to Pope Paschal, to whom he said, "Listen, apostolic bishop, shepherd whom God has placed to guide the flock of Jesus Christ. You have received the keys of the kingdom of heaven. You are the stone on which the church has been built. You are Peter, since you occupy its seat. Come to our aid." The pontiff wrote to Constantinople some letters which proved fruitless. Then St. Theodore wrote to thank him with these words, "You have been from the beginning the pure source of orthodoxy. You are the safe harbor of the universal church, her protection against the attacks of heretics, and the city of refuge that God has given us." St. Theodore and his faithful disciple Nicholas were imprisoned in Bonita for 3 years. Their sufferings were unspeakable. In the winter, the cold was very intense. In the summer, they suffocated from heat and suffered hunger and thirst, for the guards only threw them through a skylight a piece of bread every 3rd day. St. Theodore affirms that many times he thought he was dying of hunger, and adds, "But God is still too merciful to us." They probably would have starved to death if a court official who happened to visit the prison had not ordered that they be well fed. Emperor Leo intercepted a letter in which the saint exhorted the faithful to defy the infamous sect of the Iconoclasts, ordered the prefect of the East to punish the author. The prefect did not allow himself to be won over by compassion, like the jailer Nicetas, and had the monk Nicholas, to whom Theodore had dictated the letter, flogged and condemned him to suffer 100 lashes. After the torture, the executioners left the saint lying on the ground for a long time, exposed to the rigors of the February cold. St. Theodore could neither eat nor sleep for many days, and if he escaped with his life, it was thanks to Nicholas, who forgot his own sufferings, fed him drop by drop with a spoon, and bandaged his wounds, but not before cutting off the pieces of infected flesh in the sores. St. Theodore suffered unspeakably for 3 months. Before he was fully recovered, an imperial officer appeared with the charge of taking him to Smyrna, together with Nicholas. During the day they walked with forced marches, and at night they were put in chains. The Archbishop of Smyrna, who was a furious iconoclast, had the saint closely watched, and went so far as to tell him that he was going to ask the emperor to have him beheaded, or at least have his tongue cut out. But the persecution ended in 820 with the assassination of the one who had provoked it. Leo's successor, Michael the Stammerer, at first feigned the utmost moderation and lifted the sentences of banishment. St. Theodore the Studite returned after 7 years of imprisonment and wrote a letter of thanks to the emperor, exhorting him to remain united to Rome, the first of the churches, and to allow the worship of images. But Michael refused to allow the worship of the images, and to return the patriarch, the abbot of Studios, and all the Orthodox prelates who did not agree with this measure. St. Theodore, after making vain attempts to convince the emperor, left Constantinople, actually it was a form of banishment, and made a tour of the monasteries of Bithynia to encourage and comfort his supporters. "Winter is past," he told them, "but spring has not yet come. The sky is clearing and there is good hope. The fire is now extinguished, but the ashes still smoke. The influence of St. Theodore became so great that the monks in general and the Studites in particular became the bulwark of orthodoxy. Some of the saint's disciples went to join him in a monastery on the Akrita Peninsula. At the beginning of November 826, St. Theodore fell ill there. On the 4th day of his illness, he was able to go to the church to celebrate the holy sacrifice, but the illness increased and the saint dictated to his secretary his last instructions. God called him to himself the following Sunday, November 11th. His remains were transported to the monastery of Studios 18 years later. In the East, there is great veneration for St. Theodore the Studite. The Roman martyrology says that he is famous throughout the Church. The saint deserves such praise as a monastic legislator, as a defender of the supreme authority of Rome, and as a courageous proponent of the cult of images, for which he suffered so much. St. Theodore made war on the iconoclasts for theological reasons, and not because he considered images as an essential adornment of churches, since he absolutely disapproved of the pictorial representation of vices, virtues, and other unjustified excesses of religious fantasy. On the other hand, he did not believe that devotion to images was absolutely necessary. He himself seems to have practiced it very little, but only a help for the weaker brethren. In his instructions on prayer, he speaks of the union of mind and heart with God without the external help of images. But he clearly understood that to deny the validity of the cult of images was tantamount to denying the validity of certain essential theological principles. Many writings of St. Theodore are preserved, including letters, treatises on monastic life and the cult of images, sermons, and a number of hymns. These writings reflect his integrity and detachment from the world, which border on that Puritanism that characterized many of his disciples and that in some of his successors reached extremes that disturbed the peace of the Church.